Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and today I'm going to be discussing Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky lived from 1821 to 1881 in Russia, and this book was written in 1864. It's what they say is the first of his later books, not his first book, but the first of his later books, which are the sort of the most famous ones that people talk about. And the edition that I'm reading is translated by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. Um, and I only say that because there's a nice forward that they write that I also recommend that kind of helped open up this book for me. Because one thing I'll just mention is, of course, Dostoevsky is responding to a lot of things that are happening in Russia in the mid 1800s. And so you're going to miss some depth of the book. And I missed some depth of the book at first. If you don't have someone to kind of give you that history and what's being responded to. So it's useful to read the forward of this edition of the book. And I'm sure there's other good forwards and discussions that I haven't even read. Um, and it also makes you feel like it would be nice to like take a class on 1800s Russian history or like a documentary or something just to learn more about what's going on because Dostoevsky is clearly responding to some important things in that history, and it would just open the book up even more. Because I will say, if you read this book and you don't know this history and you haven't read the forward, I always like to read the forward or the introduction after I read the book. So I didn't want to read it before because I want to see how I react to the book before I know the context, before I dive in. Let me read to you the first couple lines of the book. He says, I am a sick man. I'm a wicked man, an unattractive man. I think my liver hurts. And he just kind of keeps going on and on. The book is written in two parts, and the timeline is actually backward. So the first part is after the second part chronologically. And in the first part of the book, the character is in his 40s. And in the second part of the book, he tells a story from when the character was in his 20s. So that's already an interesting style. And the first and the second part have a very different, are marked by very different features. So that's also very interesting. But the character is quite, quite a negative, cynical, nihilistic character. He talks about how self-conscious he is all the time. He's constantly in his head. He's constantly ruminating, and his ruminations are maybe by definition are just very negative. He's constantly worried about how other people are going to see him, whether he's going to seem weak, whether he's going to seem poor, all these different kinds of things, and um, his ruminations always end in some kind of self-destructive conclusion or some kind of self-destructive action. And you can relate to this character because I mean, let me tell you, I can ruminate like the best of them, for days. I can waste days just worrying about things that don't matter. And even in the middle of a rumination, I can understand that none of this actually matters like logically or rationally. Yet I can't stop my mind from, just cycling on these self-destructive or just kind of wasting time thoughts. So, I think we all can relate to this in some way, some more than others. Um, and I completely understand what it's like to be sort of too self-conscious in the middle of a social situation, and you can kind of get in your own way. So there's a lot of things you can relate to here, but the character is turned up to such an extreme level that I find it hard to relate to the character, even though, again, I can relate to certain aspects of this character for sure, no doubt about it. I have my problems, which are very similar to this character in a lot of ways. But again, it's just turned up to such an extreme that it just feels like, okay, I can't relate to this character at this extreme level. And that starts to make you think and wonder, like, what is Dostoevsky trying to do with this character? I don't think he wants me to relate to this character because he's just turned up the volume so high that it seems like he's doing something else. It's kind of like relating, with the character Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report. He's clearly trying to make fun of conservatives, so it'd be kind of weird to relate to him as a conservative, even though the fact is that actually a lot of conservatives did relate to him. But it seems like he is trying to do some kind of satire here. And you do, when you read the forward, you do it starts to open up even more that he is trying to do satire here, that he is making fun of things. And so then it starts to make sense why the character is so extreme. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are characters like this in the world, but for the most part, we don't come in contact with them because they're so insufferable that they just don't have. I mean, I just don't think you'd want to be around these people. And this character in the book is just, completely insufferable, and he doesn't have friends for them, and he doesn't. He just kind of like the reason why he's an underground man is because he just kind of like, you know, sticks to his hole, sticks to his underground, and doesn't want to like interact with people. But psychologically, you get the feeling that he talks about at one point that he didn't have parents, that maybe he was just so hurt by the world that he is just stuck in this inability to trust anyone. And because he's unable to trust anyone, he's constantly just defeating himself and defeating any options of maybe true friendship that he could possibly cultivate because he's just so hurt that he just keeps destroying everything. I don't know. I don't think that's the only psychological analysis I think I'll give because I think it's dangerous to analyze too much the psychology because again, this character has been constructed by Dostoevsky for a purpose here, and I don't want to get distracted too much by how you can just kind of get frustrated with this character. I do think that on an initial sort of shallow reading, that's what you're going to get from this book. And whether you like it or not, it's going to be whether you can relate to the character or whether you find it interesting to analyze the character psychologically. And I think that's an important level to start. But I think the book opens up even more when you get some of the ideas about what um, Dostoevsky is trying to criticize inside of the Russian history at the time. So let me try to open some of that up for you. And this comes from, again, from the forward to this book, to the edition I was reading. And they mentioned that there's sort of two stages in the evolution of Russian academics or intellectuals at the time that he's trying to criticize. And what's interesting is he's criticizing the intellectuals of the 1840s and of the 1860s. So there's a 20-year gap, which makes sense to the character in the story. We get his story from when he's in his 20s, and then we get these monologues from when he's in his 40s. So he's mirroring the time periods in Russian history. And during the 1840s, this is marked by like sentimentality. It's very literary age. It's very like romantic age and the age of the liberals. And then in the 1860s, it changes to this very like rational, sort of utilitarian, sort of cut and dry. We just kind of maximize the public good. And this is marked by nihilism in the way that the translators discuss it. And the fact that that gets marked by nihilism tells you that it's a very particular type of rationalism and utilitarianism. Because I think you can imagine, and there's other places in history where rationalism and utilitarianism wasn't marked necessarily by such a nihilistic uh, um, worldview, but in the type of rationalism and utilitarianism that Dostoevsky is responding to, it is this sort of very nihilistic, and also there's this like very idealistic sort of idea that if we just followed what the rational, like if we're just rational and just utilitarian, that like everything's just going to come together and like become perfectly good, and it will just kind of work out in this very idealistic way. And Dostoevsky is trying to criticize that and say, that's just not going to happen. That's just not how these things work. And in this sense, I very much agree with Dostoevsky. And it's funny because the character in the first part of the book is so negative and cynical at times, and he kind of jumps all over the place, but he's also quite linear and lucid despite that characterization. Like he's it's very much like almost like a philosophical essay at times, or he's just going on these rants that are, it feels like Dostoevsky is speaking through the character at times and criticizing utilitarianism, criticizing a certain type of rational politics that thinks that you can just kind of like add everything up and then figure out some like objective way to operate. And other times in the beginning, you get the feeling that Dostoevsky is not speaking to the character, but putting words into the character's mouth in order to show you how silly they are or how destructive of a point of view it is. but you can follow the logic of the character when he goes on these different, um, speeches in the first part of the book. But it is very negative and cynical and nihilistic in tone. Um, and yeah, again, you just get this feeling that Dostoevsky is speaking to the character. And then in the second part of the book, it's a completely different style. It's more of like a novel. He's telling a story about this character, and there he's criticizing this more like romantic view, this more literary view, and idealistic in a different way that like, it's very rosy and things will work out a certain way. There's like all these fantasies and the way things are supposed to be. And what's interesting here is that he criticizes this in a few ways, but one very interesting way is that there's like this typical story that apparently was popular in Russia, but also is kind of a trope that we find in movies even today of like a prostitute being saved by some man that's like nice to them, right? And this is like a story that we see in movies today and was apparently a typical story that was used in mid 1800s Russia as well. And the way that Dostoevsky kind of criticizes that is, first of all, the character is not the kind of character that could pull this off in a story. I mean, he's so self-destructive and he's not going to be a hero character. It's just not the kind of person he is. But Dostoevsky puts him in a situation where he could save this prostitute, but then the character just completely blunders it, despite the fact that the prostitute seems open. I don't know about being open to being saved, but open to having some kind of relationship with this character, or at least being, some kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or not is a different story. Um, the main character just completely blunders it and is complete asshole to her, and she just winds up, leaving. And you get the sense that she got the upper hand at the very end of that interaction, and that you just either feel bad for the character that he just can't get out of his own way, or you're just so sick of this character that you just feel repulsed by his inability to open up emotionally to this prostitute Eliza at all. Um, but that's Dostoevsky's way of criticizing this like very romantic story, this like idealistic fantasy story of, saving a prostitute. And again, but it's also his way of just criticizing this romantic literary sort of time period in general. And also in the second part, the prostitute Eliza talks about how the main character seems like he's just reading from a book. And also the main character in the second part always has these fantasies. And when the world doesn't sort of fit his fantasies, he completely self-destructs. And this is also Dostoevsky's way of criticizing what he saw as this very romantic, very idealistic, um, intelligentsia of the 1840s. He thinks that led to the nihilism of the 1860s. Like when you're too idealistic and you promise these fantasies and the world doesn't deliver because the world can't deliver on these fantasies that you made up, then it's inevitable that people are going to become nihilistic. And I think, that there's some real wisdom to this. Dostoevsky's right about that. You have to always, in the history of ideas, you see over and over again that when you promise too much and you're too idealistic in your worldviews, and then that doesn't come through, right? In the original, when you're idealistic, it gets people excited, it gets people passionate, it gets people hopeful. But when you raise that bar too high and then you can't deliver, then the backlash is this sort of extreme nihilism. And as human beings, we're constantly swinging so far from one direction to the other. And so Dostoevsky does a really good job of criticizing this part. And what's interesting about this book, because the time frame is backwards, and because of how the way it's written in the first and second part, when you get done with the book, you have this feeling that you want to go back and read the first part. And that's exactly what I did. So I read the first part, then I read the second part, then I went back and read the first part again. Because you want to sort of make some connections and you want to like think about the character now chronologically, which is an interesting kind of writing device to kind of want to force you to read again, not the entire book, but the half of the book again. Um, but then that means the first part of the book, which is happens chronologically after, is criticizing this more rational and utilitarian philosophy, this more nihilistic philosophy that came after this romantic period in the 1840s. So then in the 1860s, there's this more nihilistic. Um, and the character talks about in that first part, he's constantly like using math as a metaphor for like, which I don't always like when that people use math as this kind of metaphor, though I understand why they do that. But he uses like mathematics, like 2 times 3 equals 4, and log tables and things like that, as a metaphor for a certain kind of naive utilitarianism that he wants to criticize, that just sort of thinks that if you like get everything on a spreadsheet and tally everything up, then magically you're going to figure out how to organize society. And even though I don't like the metaphor, I completely agree with Dostoevsky here. This utilitarianism might be like a useful framework for some things, but it's a complete fantasy in the sense that um, you have this idea that you're just going to tally everything up and it's going to be objective. But of course, anytime you want to maximize happiness or minimize suffering, there's always an objective function. You have to choose a function that tells you how to sum up the happiness and how to sum up the bad experiences. And the fact that you have to choose a function means it's not going to be objective. As soon as you choose the function, yes, you can, it's a insanely difficult optimization problem like that already has problems, but let's just assume you could actually optimize. As soon as you pick the function, yeah, you can try to optimize. But the fact that you have to pick the function means it's not going to be objective. That we're not going to agree on how to tally these things up. And it's so absolutely complicated because you're talking about millions and billions of people, and you're talking about all kinds of different economic issues, all kinds of different value differences. And this idea that you can somehow work that out and pick an objective function in some kind of objective way is just insanity to me. It's so naive. And so I agree with Dostoevsky about the naivete of these kinds of rationalists who think that if we're just rational and we're all rational together, we're going to all go to the same place. Like this is ridiculous to me. I definitely believe in reasoning and science and logic and mathematics. Like I do not reject those things, but I think what we need to be careful of is this kind of naivety that thinks that if you're just rational, it'll just all lead to the same place. And that's just not how it works. And I think a good dose of philosophy will open your mind up to the fact that that's just not true. That doesn't mean we reject rationality. It means that we take a more sober view of it and we don't run into the trap that, again, Dostoevsky is trying to warn us about of promising too much, of being way too idealistic and then falling short and causing this nihilistic backlash. Okay, good. Now, something else though that we learn in the forward that's interesting is apparently this book was heavily censored and certain passages were removed. And what's interesting is we get this little passage about Dostoevsky commenting on some of the things that were removed and how he was frustrated about it. So when the first part appeared in Epic, which was a magazine that Dostoevsky and his brother were part of, Dostoevsky complained in a letter to his brother that the 10th chapter, the most important one, where the essential thought is expressed, had been drastically cut by the censors, where I mocked at everything and sometimes blasphemed for form's sake, that is, let it pass, but where from all this I deduced the need of faith in Christ that is suppressed. So Dostoevsky was constantly struggling in his life between what he should believe. He's considering a lot of different views. I really respect him as an intellectual for that. But in his later works, he certainly is trying to suggest that like the answer is Christianity. That like without some kind of objective basis or without some kind of firm values in place, like that it leads to the kind of problems that he's illustrating in the first and second part of the book. And here's where I get a little frustrated that that's the message Dostoevsky was trying to get across, because for me, it does bring me back to growing up in the Christian church, where I think there's this very black and white thinking about the kind of options that you have. And as a kid, I was presented with this picture of what atheists are like. And, the picture that was painted, like atheists sound awful. Like, I don't want to, who would want to be around these kind of people, right? hateful. They're constantly negative. They're nihilistic all the time, cynical. It could be as extreme as like they're constantly they don't care if babies die or these things die or they don't care about anything. And of course, that characterization of that kind of atheist, like no one should want to be around that kind of person, nor would you want to support that kind of philosophy. But of course, this dichotomy just is not how it exists. Like this dichotomy that was presented to me in the church, that you're either like a Christian and you care about the world, or you're an atheist and you don't care about anything, it's just not how it is, right? Like there are just many more options. There are plenty of different types of Christians. Some of them I can respect, and some of them I think are just awful. And then there's lots of different atheists. Some of them I can respect, some that I think are awful. And so I will say I'm a little bit disappointed in because in some sense I think Dostoevsky is very open to considering different ideas, and he has a very firm. It's very interesting how he criticizes them, but also presents them in their totality. But in a certain sense, he seems to have a little bit of a overly simplistic, overly black and white view of things. Now, to be fair, he's responding to philosophical views that are present in Russia during his time. So we should be fair to him. He is being a little more practical. He wants to respond to the particular philosophies that he sees ruining, Russian society at his time. So, in that sense, I get it. He thinks this is the way, the right way, or what could help Russia is maybe like a return to the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, or something like this. And I'm sure Dostoevsky has his criticisms of the church too, because he's he's an intellectual. He really thinks and questions things, so he's not going to just accept the church and all its sort of tradition and things like that. So let's be fair to Dostoevsky, but I can't help but respond to my own experiences, and I just think that the church very often presents this super black and white dichotomy, and I just don't think that's a fair characterization. But also, atheists who want to like champion science and rationality also, I think, can present things in a very black and white dichotomy. So just to be clear, I am against like all these overly simplistic dichotomies that make it seem like the choices are so clear between one or the other option. For me, what philosophy is supposed to do is point out the fact that there are just no black and white dichotomies. Everything's gray, and no questions really ever get answered. We just collect a bunch of different points of view. And for me, the goal is to make some kind of peace with that reality. And so I am a little frustrated when things are pointed out or presented in too sort of black and white a way. And also because I've been reading so much existentialism lately, and if you've been following this channel, you've been seeing that Camus and Sartre and de Beauvoir all sort of mention quotes from Dostoevsky. That's part of the reason why I read this book. And one of the quotes, I'm going to paraphrase it, is something like, if God is dead, then everything is permitted, right? This is something that Dostoevsky speaks through a character, I believe, in The Brothers Karamazov. And even that to me is a very black and white way of thinking about things because, well, first of all, you have to actually believe in God in order for the ethics that come along with Christianity, for instance, to actually have any hold on your life. And this idea that that's somehow objective, it's only objective if you buy into it, right? So, and that initial buying into it is the whole problem. Some buy into it, some don't. And this is why Kierkegaard is so, he talks about taking this leap of faith across the chasm because you have to leap into the beliefs. Once you get into the beliefs, then yes, they provide a framework for your life. Even there's some gray area, but I get it. You get a framework. But that initial leap is the whole problem, right? And the fact that you have to take this leap means that it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And the fact that you think that if God doesn't exist and everything's permitted, you're forgetting that not everything, I mean, yes, in principle, everything's permitted, but in practice, it's not because we all provide friction on each other, right? We all provide constraints on each other. And so those constraints between the few people that I interact with all the time and then the more people I interact with indirectly in my state, in my country, in the world, all these constraints start to build up um, to the fact that not everything is permitted, right? I could go kill someone, but that's not going to just be allowed. I'm going to be put in jail, or I'm going to be, there's going to be consequences. So I think this is a very naive idea. Again, a very black and white idea that as soon as you lose God, everything's permitted. Of course, it's chaotic. These constraints that we put on each other don't always lead to these like flowery, great outcomes. They lead to some pretty awful things sometimes, but they do constrain us, and they don't just allow anything. Again, I think I worry that Dostoevsky is falling into his own trap of promising, that Christianity could do too much, and Christianity could also be romanticized, and could also be too sentimental, and can sort of put the bar of hope too high. And again, Christianity can lead to nihilism as well. So, Dostoevsky, I think, has to worry about his own message. But I think, again, Dostoevsky is the kind of intellectual and the kind of writer in his later works I think does wrestle with this. So let's be fair to him. But I also have to just kind of share my own experiences and my own reactions to the text. So, this does make me want to read some of his other works, but they're so long. So we'll see when I get the time to do it. It makes me want to dive into some more Russian history. And I really do recommend the book. I hope you take a chance to read it. But again, make sure that you dive into more of the depth and don't just get lost in the immediate sort of reaction to the character. Try to think about what Dostoevsky is trying to say, as I've kind of presented to you. So let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video.